Okay, so due to popular demand and voting on the videos not yet receiving the Callendale treatment, I'm going to hit Empire of the Sun. This wouldn't be at the top of my list, and in fact I had to jump it quite a bit, clipping the counters ahead of time, reading the rules, etc., because of the voting there, so don't tell me that the voting is totally unimportant. This scored the most votes fairly early, and the only other thing up there with it, I think, is 1830, which will be no problem. This one, however, is in my new pile, so I was planning on doing it sometime soon, and oh boy, that thing keeps growing. I'm going to give you some first impressions. One thing to realize here, though, because this is a popular game, I want to make this clear. This is my first playing. I don't know the rules well. I sure don't know the strategy well. If you're hoping to get some kind of special insight into either an understanding of the rules or of the strategy, this isn't where you want to be. You're going to be seeing someone's first exploration of the game, and of course I'm going to do that as a playthrough, however long it takes. So the first thing I noticed about it was, oh wow, there's hexes. This is a CDG, a card-driven game, right? It's by Mark Herman. That was very shocking to me. The last place I expected to see hexes appear in the CDG design was in a primarily naval game, because there it seems like these abstract areas make a lot more sense to me than perhaps they would in something like Paths of Glory. I was going to say For the People, but For the People I think works very well with area or point-to-point, however you want to call it. It's the same thing, it's just how much space you want to devote and how much effort you want to put in the map. Point-to-point's easier to draw, harder to understand. In this case, though, hexes, very easy to understand, at least as easy as areas, but it struck me as a little odd. I think it works, though, because it allows the game to cover distances between objects better than maybe Victory in the Pacific. Speaking of which, this sits somewhere between, and it's a place that I have no games that are in. Of course, I have very few Pacific Theater of Operations, or I'll call it the ETO. Inside joke. Very few games covering the Pacific that I've played. I've played with, on the Eastern Front. I've played Empire of the Rising Sun. This is less detailed than either of those. I've also played Victory in the Pacific. This is far more detailed than that. It sits in an area that I had this huge span of space that I was lacking anything of any games that covered it very well. And I'm hoping this will fill that space very nicely. So far it looks like it will, but again, I don't really have a great grasp on it yet. This is a learning game. I also recently picked up another of Herman's designs, Pacific War. That's not clipped yet. Which I think will be the most detailed of those that I have. I've seen War in the Pacific set up. I've never played it. I think that's probably beyond my taste. One thing I wanted to share outside of the game, but for those who want little bits of my garbage, this here is my counter clipping remnants mixed in with tobacco, used tobacco. Just thought I'd share a little piece of my insanity. Kind of pleases me to look at that. Alright, let's go and look at what the game's about. So, first of all, like Victory in the Pacific, and perhaps like any purely Pacific theater war game, it's clear Japan is not going to win the war on this board. You have the strategic situation is not favoring them. They're attacking a country that's much, much more powerful, or actually maybe more than one country, that's much more powerful in terms of total output, production, worldwide, industry, etc., in terms of the United States. But also Britain would not be a minor force for Japan to contend with. And they're taking both of them on right from the beginning. At the same time that they're involved in a land war in China. This is a situation that, Japan is not going to win. The only question there would be, well, will the European war cause Japan to win? So the precept for what the victory in this is basically Japan has to survive longer to get kind of a more marginal victory, I believe, or they could actually drive the U.S. political will down to zero, treaty negotiations, which means Japan's going to get to surrender, but it's not going to be an absolute unconditional surrender. Those are kind of the victory conditions they're aiming for, which is, to me, somewhat unsatisfactory for a strategic level game. But given the nature and the world this is in, with the rest of World War II going on, unless you're going to say, yeah, and the game may actually cover this, I don't know how the cards work, but there's this War in Europe track, which heavily affects the U.S.'s commitment to the Pacific theater, and allows, perhaps with bad card draws, or good, depending on whose side you're on, Japan to be in a stronger position. I think there's still the assumption, though, no matter what with the cards, that war in Europe is not going to be lost by the U.S. If it would be, that would probably unbalance the game too much if that was a real possibility. So let's try to look at a little bit into the rules. Remember, again, though, I'm not going to be able to go into detail in these, not just because they're long, they're not terrible. There's a good 30 pages, which I could probably cover if I understood them fully, at least at some high level. But I may be stumbling here, and in my play, I certainly will be stumbling as to, not just the application of the rules, but the strategies, etc. in this. If that's what you're looking for, this isn't the series you want. What you want is probably to look at some of GMT's house organ, the C3I, which I hear has some very good articles on this game. That would be the most recent one. I haven't gotten a chance to look at them, so I'll be even less informed than you if you have those. Okay, so the basic sequence of play: reinforcement segment, nothing too complex there. Replacement, strategic warfare. That affects basically the U.S. submarine war can reduce the Japanese hand size. Now, I'm assuming you're fairly familiar with some CDGs already if you're facing this thing. I would strongly suggest playing at least something to get used to that operations and event combination before this, as well as perhaps playing some other tactical war games with strategic level or operational level war games with hexes. Not that this is terribly like either of those, but I think some of the disciplines involved are more interesting if you understand the couple of different design paths that led up to this. And this is a complicated game to step into, even with all that experience. So it's certainly not something I would say is a good first move in either case, although it does look like an intriguing game. All right, so then we go to the offensive phase, and this is the meat of the game. This is, and like with any CDG, this is where both players alternate playing these cards, and we can dissect them in a little bit, in order to move their units and take actions. Now, the two cards that I have out here are the beginning of the game. Operation Z, which is the Pearl Harbor attack, and this IAI, which is the Japanese operations in Indonesia, Indonesia, and over here in Malaysia, as well as Hong Kong. Just this whole operation to seize control of these areas that they were holding back from because they didn't want to involve themselves in the Great War yet. Okay. So how do the cards work? Well, they're a little different from other CDGs. They do have that choice between an operation, which is going to be this number here, and an event, which gives a series of perhaps more powerful, well, different actions. If it's an offensive operations, an offensive event, it should be a more powerful choice than just using your operations points. We also, though, have some additional things here. In particular, we have intelligence numbers up here, which are going on other cards are going to be a range of numbers which the reactive player is going to try to roll under in order to move your operation out of a surprise attack if you're doing a combat operation. Presumably there are events that are not combat operations as well. There are also a couple of must-play ones like Tojo Resigns, which just take effect as the event as far as I know. Again, I haven't studied the cards. I don't like to do that. I like to be surprised in games. Okay. So let's go through the rest of the phase fairly quickly. A political phase where you determine who controls what and what some of these track markers move on. An attrition phase where if you're out of supply, you take a reduction, and then again a cleanup at the end of the turn. So the meat is all in this offensive phase. And what happens there, in general, let's ignore the events because I don't know them, and they presumably explain themselves pretty well and are special rules for the game itself. So, unlike other games, the operations value is used even if the event is triggered, if you're doing an offensive operation. So in this case, for example, with Operation Z, this operations number, well, these are not great choices because they're so specific. The operations number is used as a multiplier for how far your forces can move. And each different type of unit can move a different allowance. So for example, land units have a base movement allowance of 1. Air units have an allowance which is actually printed on them. For example, this guy has a 2, but he also has a 4 extended range. I'm a little confused because I think some of the counters are not completely printed. Which is to say, for example, this Japanese air unit, I believe that 5 should be parenthesized. That's an extended range, and that allows, if you're not going to enter combat, for your planes to make longer flights. But it's still affected by this multiplier. Now for planes, that wouldn't make sense that you'd just be able to fly as far as you like. So what happens? Well, you have to hit a number of air bases that you control in hops to make your flight. So the operations number, which is this multiplier, allows you to travel further, but it doesn't give you free fuel on board your planes or something like that. It's just this mechanism to show that you've had more time to prepare your attack and to launch different wings of it, etc. Okay. And naval units have a movement allowance of 5 base, and they don't have to worry about basing for their different hops. The other thing that's important here is you have headquarterses, and that isn't one of them. There's one, which have their own values. Let me make sure I understand what those are. So the first number on a headquarters is the range. That's how far you have to be from the headquarters for the headquarters to be able to, well, to order you to do something, or to react. There's also an effectiveness number, which is the second number, and that determines how many units the headquarters can activate in order to take operations or reactive operations, as the case may be. Now, 1 doesn't sound like a very big number, right? Except if you're doing operations points off a card, you add the ops value of the card. So with this card, if it weren't an event, it would give that headquarters 4 operations that it could trigger. What else do we want to look at? Let's look at some of the naval units, which are also broken up into values. So with a naval unit, you've got the attack and the defense strength, and in this case they happen to be the same. Here's an aircraft carrier. It has an attack, a defense, and a range. That's the range that the airplanes can head out. So like planes on an airbase, planes on a carrier can also exert their influence beyond the hex that the unit's in. And that's very important, because when you're actually attacking a hex, you don't move the carrier into the hex. You use it as it would be a floating airbase with its planes attached. You don't have to land separate planes. The planes aren't kept track of separately, which is a little odd, given for example, Japanese, say, training issues in terms of their Air Force was very good, especially their naval fighters, at the start of the war, but as things went on, their new the new recruits for their naval air wing became less and less skilled. They had less and less training time, and that I don't think is particularly well represented just by the numbers in the rules. There may be cards which affect that, though. I wouldn't be shocked, because this is designed by someone who's quite familiar with this particular topic, having made one of the classics in it. Okay, and this may be another one. So one of the other things to factor in is that intelligence value. When you launch an attack of any kind, an operation, the attack's considered to be a surprise attack. If the defender can roll under, and there'll be some numbers here as I explained, under the operations value if you do an operations card, or under the EC for the event card if you're using the event, then the attack is downgraded from a surprise attack into an interception attack, in which case both sides get to fire at the same time in any combats. There are other effects as well. For example, a surprise attack you cannot react to. An interception attack you can. There are also reaction cards which can downgrade it to an interception, or even worse, to an ambush. An ambush also allows interceptions, but it means that the defending or reacting player, as it were, gets the first blow in. And that can be huge. I mean, if you get first shot in and you do all your damage before your opponent does, you could wipe them out. As in Pearl Harbor, where you have a surprise attack, and the U.S. basically got essentially no response and did no damage to the Japanese when they attacked. How is that combat handled? Yeah, these are how you make one country, one area surrender. It's not there. It's got to be here. So both ground and naval combat are handled essentially the same way. You roll a die, you add modifiers, and you come up with a multiplier to your total force, and you do that much damage to your opponent's defense factors. And you have to overcome the opponent's defense factors. In general, the attacker, or the die roller, or whatever, gets to apportion the combat results. But there are some restrictions there. For example, every unit has to take one step loss before anything takes a destroyed step, right? And you have these two-step units. So this guy, he's already on his flipped side. Some of the units start off damaged. But if he's here, he's much larger at an 18-12 for attack and defense. It goes down to a 9-12. It's just as hard to hit him even though he's smaller. But he has less offensive capability. And if he takes that second step, he's destroyed. Some destroyed units can be rebuilt. But at the beginning of the game, many of the units have this little yellow dot on them, which means they are not eligible to be rebuilt ever. They're removed from play at that point. You have an option once per turn to bury one of your cards in a future offensive. That means you've already chosen not to use that card this turn, and you can use it to grab initiative at the beginning of another turn, or just to hold a card, because you must play all your cards in a turn. So if you have, say, an impressive reaction card, you may want to bury it in there for a time when your opponent's going to attack. Of course, if you do it on the turn, you can't use that card on the turn you bury it. So you may want to hold that reaction card and then as your last card slide it under there. Okay, one of the key factors to the combat rules here is that air units project the zone of influence. And basically, that zone of influence prevents naval landings, from what I can tell, on a space where it exists. Now, you can cancel that zone of influence out by moving your own air units or a carrier within range of the hex you want to attack, and then you'll be allowed to land your attack in there. We'll get a little bit into the mechanics of the battles, etc., as they happen. The whole system is very different from anything that I'm used to, so we may be blundering a little bit here. One thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take... Oh, hey. I was going to say, I don't know where these cards are, but they've got these little counters, and I don't know what they are, but this is a picture on them. Ah, yes, there's a battle factoring thing, and I don't know where you track that, maybe on here, because I don't see anywhere else that could be kept track of, so it must be there. Okay, anyway, I don't remember where I am in thoughts here. So, yeah. I'm not going to go in too much detail because even though I've made it through the rules a couple of times, I'm still not comfortable with them. I've fiddled around with that, with the starting scenario, and I still don't feel a good grasp of them. I'm hoping by the end of the game to have a decent enough grasp that maybe I won't be making lots of mistakes or paging through the rules all the time. It is a very, very different design than I've ever seen before. And to me that's exciting, but also much more difficult to approach. So one of the things that the game gives is this comprehensive example of play after the scenarios. And that's a useful thing in some games. In this one I feel like it's almost necessary because it's giving you the historical actions of, among other things, of these first two cards. I am going to follow them religiously, although the die rolls will be new, because I don't believe that I am capable at this point of doing better in terms of a strategic attack than the Japanese historically did, just in terms of setting it up. So I'm going to follow that absolutely by the book on this first play. Maybe I'll have some thoughts afterwards of, oh, this might have worked better. It also then covers the second turn of the game, although I don't believe it goes through the whole thing. It looks like it only goes through a couple of cards in that second. I am not going to follow that. I'm going to hopefully know enough about the game after that first turn to be able to you know, come up with my own strategies, etc. Anyway, I don't know how much value this is going to be to people, but I figured I'd video my first playing. If I feel I need another one and desire another one, I will. Otherwise, like with many other things, it'll just go back on the shelf until such a time as I really do want to approach it again. All right.